From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about Iraq. We'll be discussing the political and economic challenges facing the country, the state of US-Iraqi relations, and the potential impact of the upcoming US elections in November. Thankfully, we've got three great guests on the program today to help us make sense of things: Randa Slim, Robert Ford, and Hafsa Halawa. Randa's a senior fellow and the director of MEI's Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program. Robert is a senior fellow at MEI and Yale's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. He was previously a career member of the U.S. Foreign Service, during which time he served as the Deputy Ambassador to Iraq and Ambassador to Syria, among other positions. Hafsa is a non-resident scholar with MEI and an independent consultant working on political, social, and economic affairs and development goals across the Middle East, North Africa, and the Horn of Africa. Randa, Robert, Hafsa, welcome to the program, and thank you all for joining us today.
Nice to be with you.
Thank you for having me.
Good to be with you all.
Hafsa, to start off with, for our listeners who may not be following the situation as closely as the three of you are, what are the most pressing challenges facing Iraq right now?
Oh, Alistair, how much time do we have? No, in all seriousness, the challenges facing Iraq, I would actually argue, are not necessarily different to where we were at maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, even up to 5 years ago, but they are certainly exacerbated. And there are very particular security concerns that have increased in recent months and in the last sort of 12 to 18 months in particular. Unfortunately, Iraq faces challenges on all fronts. It's economic and fiscal challenges, social, political, and security. The most documented is the security situation vis-a-vis militia groups, be they, a part of the Hashd al-Sha'bi or the PMF, those particular militias aligned or allied to Iran, and the standoff with US presence in the country that sort of bleeds into the broader political crisis, where parliament is completely stagnated, refusing or lacking the political will to push forward a reform agenda, which exacerbates a social crisis of political unrest, protests ongoing since the October uprising began last year, and increasing with the COVID crisis. Iraq is now the hardest hit Arab nation across the Middle East and North Africa, exceeding the number of cases that Saudi Arabia hit earlier in the summer, and with an incredibly depleted and destroyed healthcare system across the country, both through corruption over many years, but also because of a lack of reconstruction and focus on liberated areas post the most recent conflict against ISIS. And that also, of course, the global COVID pandemic and the crash in oil prices, Iraq, its budget being 97% dependent on its oil revenues to survive, exacerbating an economic crisis owing to continued mass spending that the country simply can't afford. So in a nutshell, it faces crises on all fronts.
Randa, as Hafsa referenced, at the beginning of October 2019, Iraqis took to the streets en masse in a wave of protests against corruption, economic woes, unemployment, and the failures of the political system. 1 year on, what has the protest movement accomplished, and where does it stand?
I mean, the protest movement brought down a government. That's at least one accomplishment. However, let me contextualize the 2019 protest movement against an ongoing series and waves of protest since 2011. And in 2011, there were protests in Baghdad and the south that were put down violently at the time by the government of Nour al-Maliki. At the time, they called them the Iraqi Spring, because of the Arab Spring protest that was going on. We have seen 2012, 2013, again, protests in Anbar provinces and other central provinces also in terms of demanding release of prisoners, calling for transparency. And then 2015, again, another wave of protests. And with every wave of protests, we see the number expanding. And the particular part about 2015 is the profile of the participants. It was much younger than in the past, and a lot of members of the community that is the core or the stronghold of the regime, Shia communities, participated in the protest. At the time, the late Iraqi sociologist Falah Jaber talked about these protests marking a shift from identity politics to issue politics. And then that protest movement continued for a while. Muqtada Sadr tried to, of course, take advantage of it and jump on its bandwagon. And then in 2016, it fizzled for a number of reasons. Partly it's fatigue of the protesters, not getting far in achieving what they wanted. And partly because, some of the organizers started to feel disenfranchised by the co-optation of the protest movement by the Sadrists. And then in 2018, in the summer, you have also protests in Basra, especially, against electricity outages and water shortages and the quality of water, and in other also southern provinces. In October 2019, that's when I think you had a larger group coalescing, and you had some kind of the shift, of course, to issue politics still there, but also you have a new kind of identity, rising, a national identity rising and articulated by the protesters. And over time, what we have seen is the protesters, and in 2019, the bulk of them were under 30, and many of them have not experienced the Saddam era. Some of them were born in 2003, and the others were born shortly before, and so they never experienced the horror and of the Saddam era. So what happened in 2019, you have this break between this generation of Iraqis, which, by the way, has experienced the biggest bulge. Iraq today is experiencing one of the biggest youth bulge in the Middle East. So you have a split between this generation and the 2003 political elites that came with the US occupation. And this generation of youth started to see the ethno-sectarian system put in place in 2003 as inextricably linked to corruption, to bad services, to unemployment. And so, in a way, total break between that generation that wants to see this political system perpetuated because it benefits its interest, and this youth generation, which is the future of Iraq, that sees that the only way forward is a total overhaul of the political system.
Robert, Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi was sworn into office at the beginning of May against the backdrop of what has been, I think it's fair to say, an extremely turbulent year for Iraq, marked by popular unrest, an economic crisis, the coronavirus pandemic. How has he performed so far, and what has stood out to you?
There is no way for any prime minister in Iraq, including Mustafa al-Kadhimi, to solve all of the problems which Hafsa laid out in detail a couple of minutes ago. It would be impossible for any Iraqi politician to be able to do that. Kadhimi instead has approached the challenges in a very gradualist manner. There are no huge breakthroughs, and sometimes it appears he's not making much progress at all. What is most interesting to me is that Kadhimi has nibbled away here and there at some of the power of the militias that Hafsa was talking about. Nothing dramatic, nothing night and day from before, but little by little. He has appointed a host of new commanders into the Iraqi security establishment. He has actually used the Iraqi security establishment here and there to contain the militias. He's even gotten them to withdraw from the airport in Baghdad, which is not a small thing. On the economic side, the country has huge problems, which Hafsa and Randa were just talking about. Again, no quick fixes. He has been able to name some new people into some of the government's financial agencies that oversee investment in banking. It's a very gradual change, nothing dramatic. And above all, he's got big headwinds in his face, which Hafsa and Randa also were talking about. And so, to me, the most important thing is that Iraq hasn't gotten any worse under Kadhimi's premiership. I think in some ways it's marginally better, but plenty of big challenges remain, most immediately the economy and COVID. And Kadhimi is trying to get help for those, both inside Iraq, but also from partners outside Iraq.
So I wanted to drill down into the economic situation in a little bit more detail. According to the World Bank, the economy will shrink by nearly 10% this year amid the impact of COVID-19 and the crash in oil prices. The government has recently taken steps to move ahead with long-awaited economic reforms. On Tuesday, the cabinet released an economic reform package that Finance Minister Ali Alawi called a roadmap for reforms for the coming 3 to 5 years. What do we know about those reforms so far, and what are your expectations for their potential impact?
Thanks, Alistair. I mean, it's a really difficult thing to tackle, especially when you are technically a technocratic transitional government that, was approved in a sense to pave the way for new elections, which, at least have been suggested or to take place next year. I mean, I think for me, the most striking part of the white paper is that almost half of the sort of 96-page document is dedicated to laying out the current situation, sort of, a snapshot of the buildup of how we've reached this particular inflection point and this particular crisis. Obviously, the acuteness of this crisis right now is not necessarily of Iraq's doing. Countries across the globe, even the incredibly rich, petro-Gulf states that, along with Iraq, are the world's largest oil producers, but have much more money, are experiencing, acute fiscal problems and challenges. I mean, Saudi Arabia's budget deficit is expected to be up to 16% this year. So Iraq is not alone in this current challenge, but Iraq has to fight a very entrenched political system that has, although not necessarily the entrenchment of longevity, it's a post-2003 system that we're talking about, which is not even 20 years old, but it is a system where patronage and corruption are what effectively rule the country and rule the political elite. And they are both enabling it, but also beholden to it themselves. And that is a massive, massive hill to climb for the finance minister, for the government in place. I mean, one of the suggestions, which will be the biggest sort of eye-popping, is the the recommendation to slash public sector, the public payroll by almost half within 3 years, from 25% to 12.5%. And we've already seen, in the face of popular unrest and public and sort of protests that expand, how the government, or how the prime minister at least, is very quick to respond with, we're going to hire more people. Haider Abadi also did the same thing in his tenure before he lost the 2018 election. So it's really a catch-22 for this prime minister, particularly because his own political ambition seems to suggest that he would like to be around much longer than a transition period, as outlined, and that he himself would like to attempt to consolidate continued leadership through political activity. Now, in that scenario, there's, the PM, Prime Minister Mustafa Kadhimi, he's looking for constituency. He's looking for who he can bring into that constituency. But at the same time, building on what Ambassador Ford said, it's incredibly hard to take real hardline reform decisions, whether they be economic, which would affect the most of the population, or be they otherwise, on a more political, social, or security landscape. Beyond that as well, I mean, let's be completely honest, and repeating what Ambassador Ford said, this parliament has no political will to do anything. It's no longer even a case of being against or for an agenda proposed by the prime minister or otherwise. It simply is, I would almost argue, although it might sound alarmist or sensationalist to some, that it's collapsing in on itself. We're in the same sort of stagnation that we were when Adel Abdel Mahdi's government fell as a result mainly of protests, but a very slow erosion that has been in place for many years, I would argue, since the departure of Nouri Maliki as prime minister, where the political pie, as it were, it's not that it's expanded and there are new actors, but that we have, actors on more of an equal footing, particularly among or within this sort of Shia bloc of parties, than we did 3-4 years ago. And that's just creating complete paralysis. things are not moving. This parliament is very unlikely to pass this white paper in its current form. I commend the finance minister, Dr. Ali Alawi, for what he has created, for the suggestions he's put forward. And I would actually, argue that this was always the intention, the idea to create a blueprint for the incoming government, the next government post-elections, the government that will come in with a significant legitimacy factor, having been, supported through elections, and actually sort of, have this in the public domain, allow Iraqi citizens to make their decisions, allow Iraqi citizens to see who is really paralyzing this process, who's really stopping it, who's really preventing it from moving and progressing further, but also as a way to show the country in black and white how bad and how dire the situation is. I mean, we're talking, and I'm, the main thing that people will focus on is the slashing of public payroll, but the ideas about diversifying away from oil, these are, ideas that have been floated. They're not necessarily new in development, in agriculture, other non-oil sectors, healthcare reform, and that's not even to speak of the massive investment that's needed in reconstruction and infrastructure across the country, which the country simply doesn't have the money to pay for because it continues to tie its own spending, or at least attempts to, with oil revenues. And every year we have a bump in oil prices. They kick the can down the road, this parliament and its previous iterations, continuing to ignore the really major problems within the country that require, a real reset. And it's going to be painful whenever it comes. And the longer we wait, the harder and the more painful it will be on ordinary Iraqi citizens. But unfortunately, we do not have a parliament that seems to have the country's citizens' best interests at heart.
Randa, shifting gears somewhat, I wanted to touch on the big news this week on the security front, the announcement on Sunday that Iranian-backed militias responsible for carrying out rocket attacks on U.S. facilities and Iraqi bases hosting U.S. and coalition forces offered a conditional ceasefire, provided that U.S. forces withdraw within a, quote, acceptable time frame. How significant is this, and what do you think motivated this move?
The spokesperson of Kataib Hezbollah said in commenting on this announcement that the U.S. ultimatum to close the U.S. embassy in Baghdad has complicated the political situation inside Iraq, and it has created the necessity for putting a halt. And as you said, it's a conditional halt pending an agreement between the Iraqis and the American authorities on a timetable for the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq. Look, this position also is in line, positioned by these militias, which are affiliated with Iran, which are Iran-backed and Iran-funded, is very much in line with Iranian current posture in the region, which is basically also hitting a pause button in its confrontation with the U.S. ahead of the U.S. election, driven by the belief inside the Iranian leadership that they would like not to do anything or not engage in any kind of escalation or provocation that improves the chances of Donald Trump being reelected. I think we have to take these militias at their word that this is a conditional pause. I think we also have to understand that despite the fact that the January 5 parliamentary vote, which was mostly, by Shia parliamentarians, the session was attended maybe by one or two Kurdish politicians, were no Sunni politician. So primarily the vote on January 3rd was very much driven by pro-Iran political faction in the Iraqi Council of Representatives. I think this is going to continue to be a demand of these groups. It continue to be a demand of the Iranian leadership for the U.S. forces to withdraw. And I think it will be really, a mistake or a wrong assumption to take from this conditional ceasefire anything more than what it is. I think this non-state armed militias, which are funded by Iran, which are beholden, to Iran, which are loyal to Iran, are here to stay. They are not going to go away. Now, if we have a new administration in January, a Biden administration that is going, as it says, is going to, re-engage with Iran, maybe rejoin the JCPOA, if something left still is there by January of the JCPOA. I think that will help in decreasing the tensions between the US and Iran, and that will reflect positively on the situation inside Iraq. However, irrespective of what kind of agreement that happens between the United States and between Iran going forward, I think there is a deep belief inside Tehran, especially since the October 2019 protests, which were led and organized by Shia youth, which Tehran and took place in Baghdad, but also in the southern governorates with our Shia majority, that cemented the belief in Tehran as well as the fear that anti-Iranian Iraqi nationalism remains strong in Iraq, even among constituencies that Tehran has considered friendly until now. And so the conclusion from that realization, if we can put it this way, or from that analysis inside Tehran, has been that an armed militia presence in Iraq, whose loyalty to Tehran is unquestionable, will remain for the short to medium term Tehran's best bet against Iraq ever becoming a threat to its homeland security as the Saddam regime was. And so it is good news. It's a conditional pause. The ultimatum hopefully will not be acted upon. Then U.S. forces need to stay for some time pending an agreement with the Iraqi forces, especially to train, equip, and assist Iraqi forces in their fight against the remnants of ISIS, but also in their fight in making them, better and better organized and coordinated security forces that are important for the endurable stability of Iraq.
Robert, I'd like to get you in here as well, get your thoughts on the kind of militia and security situation. Obviously, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had been threatening to close the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad over these security concerns, and the U.S. is also in the process of drawing down its troops. How do you see that situation developing moving forward? And do you think there is a real risk of a kind of dual U.S. military and diplomatic pullout?
It's really difficult to understand what the American policy in Iraq is. I am myself puzzled. Prime Minister Kadhimi went to Washington on August 20th, 21st, had a good visit, signed a variety of agreements on energy development, and had a meeting in the Oval Office with the president. President Trump called Kadhimi a friend during the press conference. Trump said much nicer things about Mustafa Kadhimi than he says about Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, for example. So then 6 weeks later, the American Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, whom Kadhimi also met and had a reasonably good meeting with in Washington, Pompeo turns around and says, we're going to close the American embassy in 90 days if the militias are not brought under control. What that means exactly is not clear, but at a minimum, it seems the Americans wanted mortar attacks and such things to stop against the American embassy. So which is it? Is he a friend, or are we going to pull out? Not clear, and I think the administration's sort of quick backlash in September is not helpful to sending a clear message. So going forward, Randa has talked about the militias, the pro-Iranian militias, which call themselves the Coalition of the Resistance, includes Kataib Hezbollah and Asa'ib al-Iraq, Harakat al-Najaba, have said they're going to extend a ceasefire, media reports say, for at least 2 months. It seems like it would go past the American election, which probably is a calculation on both their parts and that of their friends in Tehran. After that, not so clear. But going forward, the Americans will be the most successful in Iraq if they stop trying to make Iraq a tool in their maximum pressure campaign against Iran. And if they instead would focus on working relations with Baghdad and with Iraqis in general as a separate relationship, which has characteristics as any American bilateral relationship around the world has. In the case of Iraq, problem with the neighbor next door, Iran, but that's not the only country in the world with whom we have relations where there's a troublesome neighbor next door. So the American mission, military mission, to work with the Iraqi security forces, in particular the counterterrorism service and the Iraqi army, Iraqi Air Force using F-16s, over time will give Baghdad a bit more room to assert sovereignty and to say no to Iranian interference. It will not be rapid. It will not be fast. This is about playing the long game. Sanctioning the Iraqi economy because it imports electricity from Iran, or it imports natural gas from Iran to generate absolutely vital electricity in politically sensitive areas like the Shia areas in the south, is not playing the long game. It's trying to use Iraq as a tool against Iran, and it's going to fail if that's the way Washington decides to go forward. And there are people in Washington, both in the administration and in the Congress and in the academic think tank community, who believe that is what we should do. Just give them an ultimatum, up or down, black or white. You're either with the Americans or you're with the Iranians. My own advice would be, don't do that. Kadhimi is moving slowly in a good direction. Trick is to reinforce him so that over time he gains a greater margin of maneuver. Hafsa mentioned it's not clear if he'll stay on or if he'll leave next year. We don't know. But for now, there seems to be someone we can work with gradually, not fast. Things like closing the American embassy basically would just say, we have no interest in Iraq whatsoever. Whether it be on counterterrorism issues or regional security issues or economic issues. We just have no interest. We're going to just hand it over to the Iranians and we walk out. That doesn't seem to me to be a reasonable strategy for a country of 30 million people in a really important part of the world. A minimum of diplomatic engagement and a small security assistance program don't seem unreasonable to me. And so how the Americans do that, playing the long game and not expecting fast results, working on the margins, that seems to me to be the best way forward.
Robert, looking ahead to the election in a few weeks' time on November 3rd, what do you see as the most salient potential differences between a Trump and a Biden White House when it comes to Iraq policy?
I don't work with either campaign, so I have no inside information to share with our listeners. But it's clear that the Trump administration is determined to pursue maximum pressure and strangle Iran economically. And Iraq could be a casualty in that fight, especially if it ends up grinding down the Iraqi economy through American sanctions and reductions in energy, electricity production, etc. That doesn't seem very healthy to me. And I would hope that the Secretary of State would modify his stance going forward. A 60-day waiver on American sanctions does not give the Iraqis a lot of scope to plan and to get ready for next summer's surge in electricity demand. So were there to be a Biden administration come January, he would bring with him a set of players who have a great deal more familiarity with Iraq, but Iraq of the pre-2016 period. And Iraq is different now. The protest movement that Randa was talking about didn't exist back then. And many of the players have changed. I think that the Biden administration is more likely, however, because of an old familiarity with Iraq, to look more at Iraq as a bilateral relationship where you have to manage the Iranian influence, rather than viewing it as simply an appendage of the American-Iranian competition. And of course, were that competition between Washington and Tehran to ease a bit, that would also give Iraq more breathing space and would also enable us to play that long game that I was talking about.
Hafsa, Ishan Tharoor had a piece in the Washington Post this week in which he wrote, "For ordinary people living in the Middle East mini crisis spots, it won't matter much whether President Trump or his Democratic challenger is in the White House next year." I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. Do you kind of agree or disagree with that? And what impact, if any, do you think this election is likely to have for Iraqis?
Thanks, Alistair. I mean, well, I guess to be completely blunt, I mean, that kind of statement, and I respect greatly when I read the piece, but that kind of sentiment simply, in my opinion, buys into this sort of smaller DC-based echo chamber of, the US has lost its leverage in parts of the region, or the US is on a sort of retreat agenda. I mean, being completely frank, the US as a foreign policy power is still the leading security, military, and diplomatic power across the world. That has not changed despite what we can debate being President Trump's attempt to change that. Does it matter to people across the region or Iraqis on a day-to-day how they get up and go to work, or find ways to put food on their table, look after their families, keep them safe, etc.? Probably not on a sort of granular level. Does it matter to people in the region? Of course it matters. The US has played such a large role, particularly in a country like Iraq. It continues to have an important role in Syria, which affects Iraq, of course, not just in the frame of an IDP or refugee community as such. The broader security challenges that the country faces, the US is integral in that. And I would actually argue that this election matters very much to people in the Middle East and to Iraqis specifically, because there is an opportunity, one would hope, to have a reset, to change course from the direction that the Trump administration has taken foreign policy in writ large, not just in terms of the broader debate of where the US stands, as a superpower, as the world's superpower in terms of military retreat, but merely about, what does it mean for US foreign policy in upholding the values and the rights-based approach that it has, allegedly, purported to do so for decades. And we're at a real inflection point, not only for US foreign policy, obviously, for the US domestically on that front. But I think we would like to try and tell ourselves that after all these years of for Iraq specifically, all these years of, the US-led war, US security engagement, that it doesn't matter. But it does matter. Of course it matters. And it matters to Iraqis very much, because whether they like it or not, the US plays an integral role in the country, in how the country governs itself or attempts to govern itself, still holds control over so much of the external financing and so forth, and has the ability through the various threats that President Trump has levied in the last sort of, I would say, 8 to 12 months to really collapse the country, whether it's the tweet threat of sanctions or whether it's the threat to close the embassy or otherwise. And obviously, both Randa and Ambassador Ford have talked at length about the security situation. But it will matter very much. There's this interesting thread that runs through civil societies across the region, of which Iraq is not immune, where, they sort of see Trump as comeuppance to the United States after years of what they view as failed foreign policy. At the same time, there is a burgeoning movement that needs support from the US, not just diplomatic support. It needs its additional partners and allies and foundations and organizations and aid support to endorse it, to empower it, or to help it empower itself, I should say, to provide it with, an opportunity to realize what this protest movement is really attempting to do. And it cannot do that alone, in the same way that, many of the militia partners cannot act without, the support, backing, direction, and financing of Iran and the direction that it gets from Tehran, as political actors do as well. In the same way, the civic space is arguably protected by those allies that are sort of in the US sphere of power. And it's important that the US, through this election, whatever happens, and those of us who work within the civic space or think tank community or otherwise, understand what it means to have, the US as a rights-based partner, engaged, active, coherent, and concise in its policy and supporting the right actors.
Randa, looking ahead to next January, before we wrap up here, what are the key policy changes you'd like to see the next administration make?
Let me refer our listeners to a briefing book which the Middle East Institute put out September 20 on election 2020, which includes sets of recommendations for the next administration, whether it's a Trump 2.0 or a Biden 1.0, regarding different countries in the region, as well as issues, cross-border issues like climate change, like, terrorism and financial issues. So some of these recommendations for Iraq build very much on what Robert has said and what Hafsa have said. I totally agree with Robert on this need for a long game. And as part of this long game, the need to disentangle the military security aspect of the relationship between the United States and Iraq from other aspects of the relationship, which are equally important, including diplomatic aspects, the economic aspect, cultural relations, development, and humanitarian assistance. The important priority going forward is to help Iraq as much as possible dealing with the economic challenges. Again, conditional on sets of reforms and that the legislative and executive authorities undertake. Now, Hafsa said, she's doubtful about the Council of Representatives undertaking or willingness to undertake these reforms. But I think that is something to be seen. But I think the US can help, whether bilaterally or through multilateral institutions, help Iraqi authorities dealing with the severe economic challenges right now facing the country. I think building on what Hafsa said in terms of support to civil society in Iraq, the protest movement, identify areas where U.S. civil society organizations can assist protesters and the protester movement in their efforts to fight corruption, promote accountability, good governance in Iraq. There are areas that are very much in line of the long game. So try to identify those areas where the US has a comparative advantage over Iran and where Iraq needs help. Areas such as banking reforms, assistance in the education, technology sectors, which is a major demand by the protesters. There is also an area of the commercial investment reforms. I think the regulatory framework today in Iraq, instead of promoting, encouraging the entrepreneurial spirit that we have seen Iraqi youth protesters, display day after day, instead of encouraging it, nurturing it, promoting it, in fact, it stifles it. There needs to be lots of work on the regulatory framework, especially in the area of commercial investment reforms in the private sector. And US can provide technical assistance, that Iran cannot provide. And then eventually, Hafsa talked about the internal displacement issue. I mean, this is a major issue, and I think the international community is paying enough attention to its implication on the social fabric of the country and on the civil peace in the long term. And I'm afraid it's becoming more and more a protracted issue. And I think the US, along with international organizations, working with Iraqi authorities, need to address this internal displacement issue and eventually help, and the neighbors, the Gulf neighbors, can help here in terms of financing reconstruction in ISIS-liberated areas.
We'll have to leave things there for now. But Randa, Robert, Hafsa, thank you all for joining the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. For those of you that are interested in learning more, the briefing book Randa referred to is available on the MEI website. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.